Welcome everyone to Oxford's Institute for Ethics in AI. My name is John Tsulis. I'm the director of the Institute, and it's our very great pleasure today to be launching Ted Lechtermann's book, a new book called The Tyranny of Generosity: Why Philanthropy Corrupts Our Politics and How We Can Fix It. And it's being published by OUP, I think later this year. This is a beautifully written book, lucid and rigorous, that deals with a conundrum that has become especially acute in recent years. On the one hand, it looks as though philanthropy is on its face a very good thing. It is, as Ted says, a practice that involves donations, gratuitous economic transfers, that are directed at an indefinite number of persons who are mostly or entirely unknown to the donor. So it looks like a positive thing. Yet on the other hand, Ted contends that philanthropy as currently practiced, quote, threatens critical foundations of a democratic society, unquote. In particular, it puts donors in a position to wield private power in a way that undermines the sovereignty of democratic citizens, the sovereignty that they should enjoy over matters of what Ted calls basic justice. And of course, this conundrum becomes even more exacerbated in a context in which economic inequalities continue to grow. What Ted's book does is to engage with this conundrum and to offer a path towards a form of philanthropy that is safe for democracy. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome my colleague Ted Lechterman. Ted is a research fellow at the Institute for Ethics in AI at the University of Oxford, where he's also affiliated with Wolfson College. And we're delighted to welcome our two main commentators. First is Kiara Cordeli, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. And she's the author of The Privatized State, published by Princeton in 2020, and the co-editor of Philanthropy in Democratic Societies, published by the University of Chicago Press 2016. Welcome, Kiara. And our second commentator is Maribel Morey, who is a historian of US philanthropy and the social sciences, and the founding executive director of the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences. She's the author of White Philanthropy: Carnegie Corporation's An American Dilemma and the Making of a White World Order, which was published by the University of North Carolina Press earlier this year. Welcome, Maribel. So I'm going to ask Ted to give us a brief introduction to the book before we have the commentators discuss various aspects of it. But I want to remind everyone that we are very much eagerly anticipating your comments and feedback. So please use the chat box on YouTube to send us questions. But now I'm going to turn over to Ted, who will crystallize for us in 15 minutes the essential message of this book. Thanks, Ted.
Thank you very much, John. I'm very grateful to John for allowing me to use this forum to discuss a piece of work that might seem pretty distant from the main concerns of an institute dedicated to AI ethics. In fact, I think the connections between philanthropy and technology are closer than you might realize, and I promise to say more about this in a few minutes. I'm also delighted to share the digital stage today with Kiara and Maribel, two scholars who have been doing path-breaking work on philanthropy for several years, and have really helped to blaze the trail for more recent entrants like myself. You know, one thing I've come to appreciate in working on this project is just how contested some of the terminology is. Terms like philanthropy and charity often mean quite different things to different linguistic communities. And it's very easy to talk past each other when debating normative questions in these areas. Especially in the United Kingdom, many people use the term philanthropy to refer more or less exclusively to the patronage of higher education and the arts by wealthy individuals. Academics who study philanthropy tend to use the term in a bit of a broader sense. Philanthropy in this broader sense simply refers to the donation of private property for public purposes. And it's the broader phenomenon that I'm investigating in the book. Philanthropy for me, more or less as John said before, means the voluntary transfer of private property in service of some conception of the public good. Now, this definition can certainly include donations of labor, knowledge, or kidneys, but the focus of my book is mainly on donations of money because of the particular connections between philanthropy and political power. Now, the definition of philanthropy I've just given you immediately suggests that philanthropy is an activity undertaken by individuals, and this is obviously true. But I think the majority of philosophical reflection on philanthropy has made too much of this point. When philosophers assess philanthropy, they tend to focus narrowly on the decisions of donors and the relationship between donors and recipients. Do individuals have a duty to give? Which causes deserve most support? What does it mean to give well? These are common questions in the scholarship on the ethics of philanthropy. A point of departure for my book is to treat philanthropy as a political phenomenon. Philanthropy is political in at least three ways. First, the ability to give property away depends upon laws that define property rights, contracts, and organizations. These laws vary considerably from society to society, creating broader and narrower opportunities for donation. Claims about the ethics of giving typically presuppose that current laws are already justified. I think that's not always the case. The second way philanthropy is political is that the menu of causes a donor can support depends on what areas the state has chosen not to finance publicly. This also varies tremendously from state to state. In classical Athens, for instance, military campaigns were often funded by donation. It's hard to find any theorist who would defend such a thing today. A third way philanthropy is political is that governments often directly regulate the practice of philanthropy by offering various incentives and penalties for different ways of giving and receiving. The justification for these policies is highly controversial. So once we understand philanthropy as a political phenomenon, a raft of other questions emerge. Principally, are there certain things that a society has reason to finance through donation rather than by taxation? Or does philanthropy always constitute some kind of remedial response to government failure? If philanthropy can in fact be justified, how should the practice be organized and regulated? Is private giving something that should be publicly subsidized? And if so, how? How should policies balance the interests of donors with the interests of recipients and other stakeholders? An overarching aim of the book is to draw attention to these questions, which are often overlooked in both public debate and philosophical analysis. These questions are important in their own right, but how we answer these questions also makes a tremendous difference to how we approach the individual ethics of giving. When the practice of philanthropy is legitimate, you might think that donors can take themselves to have broad discretion over the amounts they give, the causes they select, and the conditions they place on the use of funds. But when the practice of philanthropy falls noticeably short of legitimacy, you might think that the discretion donors can rightly claim is far more limited. Now, a comprehensive political theory of philanthropy would provide reasonably complete answers to all these questions. For better or worse, that's not what I attempt to do in this book. I proceed far more selectively, offering interventions on a range of different questions where I thought I might have something original to contribute. So I'm not going to try to summarize all of the claims in the book here. What I want to do now is highlight just a few key ideas. One starting point for the book is that philanthropy as we know it stands in tension with the value of democracy. Democracy requires that decisions about public matters should be made collectively on equal terms. Philanthropy is a practice that allows decisions about public matters to be made privately on the basis of wealth. If we endorse democracy, what role, if any, can there be for philanthropy? I argue that philanthropy does indeed have important roles to play in a democratic society. However, reconciling philanthropy with democracy requires more attention to the ways that benevolent intentions can end up purchasing social and political power, whether intentionally or otherwise. It requires efforts to limit the privatization of essentially public decisions and the ability to convert economic inequality into political inequality. So why might philanthropy be something to encourage in a democratic society? There are several reasons, but here are two. First, philanthropy helps to resolve the problem of reasonable disagreement about public goods. Public goods are goods that markets fail to provide efficiently for one reason or another. Goods such as art, religion, sport, education, social assistance, and so on. citizens disagree profoundly about the nature of these goods, and democratic governments notoriously struggle to provide public goods in ways that are sufficiently sensitive to this disagreement. One way of overcoming this problem is to share the responsibility for providing public goods between governments and private citizens. Let the state fund the public goods that win the approval of democratic majorities, but let democratic minorities also fund the public goods that they prefer. A further benefit of this scheme of mixed provision is that you end up with an extraordinarily rich array of public goods available for citizens to consume. A rich array because it reflects the ideas of millions of dispersed individuals in most societies. A second reason to support philanthropy is that donations are a valuable mechanism for funding civil society, a realm of associational activity that mediates between citizens and government. Civil society organizations provide opportunities for practicing the skills of citizenship, forming and debating political opinions, and contesting the conduct of the government. These range from neighborhood associations to professional societies to advocacy organizations and public interest groups. In order for civil society organizations to remain sufficiently independent of government influence, it's arguably a good idea for these organizations not to be financially dependent on the government. In short, then, philanthropy is valuable in a democratic society as a way of mitigating the limitations of majority rule and as a way of securing the organizational foundations of democratic participation. So if that's true, how might philanthropy serve to undermine democratic values? Again, in the book, I explore several reasons, but here are just two. Let's return to the idea of public goods. While I endorse the idea that philanthropy has an important role to play in the provision of public goods, I argue that there are certain goods that societies are obliged to provide more or less exclusively on a collective basis. Citizens have a vital interest in being able to supervise the provision of public goods that are essential to sustaining the status of free and equal citizenship itself. When we invite private donations for things like poverty relief, basic education, and police protection, we are ceding control of our vital interests to forces that are not authorized by us or accountable to us. Democracy, I argue, requires that citizens remain sovereign over decisions about matters of basic justice like these. Here's a second way that philanthropy might conflict with the value of democracy. Recall my suggestion that it's valuable to be able to finance civil society organizations through individual donations. Now, imagine we're in a society with wide inequalities in wealth and no limits on the amounts of money that individuals can donate. Perhaps the government even encourages people to donate through various tax advantages. Does this sound familiar? Well, one predictable consequence of this scenario is that wealthy people will be able to exert disproportionate influence over the composition and direction of civil society. Causes and organizations that serve as sites for deliberation and advocacy are going to be heavily skewed toward the preferences of wealthier citizens. This situation conflicts with the central democratic principle that members of a society ought to enjoy equal opportunities for political influence. Being economically fortunate should not necessarily make someone more politically fortunate. So to summarize, philanthropy can threaten democracy in two related but distinct ways. First, by privatizing decisions about matters that are essentially public, and second, by allowing the conversion of inequalities in wealth into inequalities in political power. So what are the solutions to these problems? I don't have any silver bullets to offer. My main goal is to try to make further progress in the diagnosis of these problems and a clearer understanding of the trade-offs we face. Do I think society should outlaw private giving for the relief of poverty, illness, and educational disadvantage? Not at all. That kind of cure could be worse than the disease. Rather, I see my arguments as underscoring the central importance of ensuring robust public funding and oversight of essential public goods. Supplying these goods well is not just a matter of efficiency or fairness, it's also a matter of ensuring public authorization and accountability. We might welcome private assistance, especially in emergency scenarios, but the goal of private assistance should always be temporary and transitional, with an eye toward facilitating the capacity for effective democratic administration. It should not be taken as an excuse for donors to entrench their role indefinitely or to push their own policy preferences on unwilling communities. When it comes to the other problem I mentioned, the problem that donations end up amplifying the influence of the wealthy over civil society, one thing I do in the book is explore some different ways of using tax policy to moderate this. Most governments provide citizens a tax deduction or matching grant for the donations they make, but the value of this subsidy depends on how much a citizen is able to donate. Because wealthier citizens are naturally able to donate more, tax subsidies end up augmenting inequalities in public influence. I propose an alternative scheme that seeks to maintain public support for philanthropic giving while moderating inequalities in opportunities to donate. The scheme would give every citizen a voucher to be redeemed for cash by the organization of their choice. Citizens who want to donate more than this can also purchase additional vouchers at increasing cost. The proceeds from the sale of the additional vouchers can then be used to fortify the value of the baseline free voucher. Now, you might be thinking this is all nuts. If we want to reduce the ability to convert wealth into power, we should just tackle inequalities in wealth directly. Now, I certainly agree with this sentiment, but only up to a point. Unless the distribution of wealth is going to be entirely equal, the ability to convert wealth into political power is going to remain a problem. And current approaches to subsidizing philanthropic giving are going to exacerbate that problem. There's so much more in the book than I can preview now, including arguments about intergenerational philanthropy, corporate philanthropy, and effective altruism. If you're interested in my analysis of these issues, I do encourage you to read the book. I should mention that, unfortunately, the book's global print release has been delayed to January due to supply chain problems. It's already available now everywhere as an ebook, and it's already available in print in the US. If you're in other parts of the world, you can pre-order a copy in print for delivery in January. Now, finally, I'll address the question you're all probably asking yourselves: what, if anything, does philanthropy have to do with artificial intelligence? Well, the short answer is that certain problems that AI presents are structurally similar. Both AI and philanthropy allow the control of social conditions to be offloaded to agents that are not democratically authorized or accountable. With philanthropy, those agents are private donors. With AI, those agents are both private corporations and autonomous systems. Studying philanthropy provides us with insights into what makes democracy valuable and how that value applies to different agents and practices. Some of these insights are highly relevant to current debates about what AI should be used for, who should control it, and how it can be accountable. I'll leave it there for now. Thanks again to my fellow panelists, and thanks to everyone watching for taking the time to be here.
Thank you so much, Ted, for that very lucid introduction. So I'm just going to ask Kiara now to kick off the commentary. So Kiara, when you're ready.
So thank you, John, and thanks, Ted. It was a true pleasure to read this excellent book. The book makes really truly a series of important contributions to the literature in philanthropy. First, it shows how the problem with philanthropy is not reducible to a question of bad intentions, lack of effectiveness, or even unjust acquisition. Rather, even if all these conditions were absent, philanthropy may still be incompatible with a fundamental democratic principle, the principle of democratic sovereignty. Second, the books, however, also defends a positive thesis that there might be justification for publicly subsidizing philanthropy, for example, when the funding of discretionary goods is at stakes. And finally, also, it sheds new lights on questions that have not been addressed really in the literature on philanthropy, at least not extensively so far, such as the question of the ethics of corporate social responsibility and on whether philanthropic institutions should be allowed to exist in perpetuity. There are many things to praise about this book. I think the most perhaps obvious thing is that it's a extremely philosophically rigorous, but also practically relevant book. And I think this is a rare virtue. But of course, today, I think my job here is to raise some critical questions. So I will first start with the question of whether it is really true that the private funding of essential public goods is necessarily ruled out by a principle of democratic sovereignty. So democratic sovereignty, according to Ted, is grounded on two more fundamental principles: a relational account of political equality that sees the equal distribution of political control over certain decisions as a necessary condition of social equality, and also on a view of the value of collective self-determination as a practice that enables citizens to feel at home in their society, that is, to recognize themselves in the decisions that affect their lives. But if this is the grounding of democratic sovereignty, it is not fully clear to me what would be wrong with a democratic decision that left the financing of essential goods entirely in the hands of private philanthropy. So not only the citizens could reasonably feel at home in this society because it's the result of their decisions after all, but also given that gross background inequalities are assumed away, then it's not clear that this society would generate very large relational inequalities. And even if it generates relational inequalities, one could say these relational inequalities would be legitimized by a previous relationally egalitarian political decisions and therefore not incompatible with relational equality overall. So Ted seems aware of this problem because I think at some points in the book, he argues, and here I quote him, while we might authorize private agents to administer the provision of essential public goods in light of our wishes, ongoing control over the terms of authorization is inalienable. And here I end the quote. But it seems to me that a democratic government could entirely delegate the funding of essential goods to private philanthropy, while at the same time, say, retain the right and responsibility to revisit, right, this decision, say, every 4 or 5 years. So in this way, the government would arguably keep ongoing control over the terms of authorization. It would simply just delegate, right, the power to fund. So I just want to ask Ted, perhaps I'm curious to know how he would answer to this possible challenge to the view that even in the restricted case, philanthropy could be incompatible with democratic sovereignty. Now, turning to my second question. Is an appeal to reasonable pluralism really sufficient to justify public subsidies to philanthropy? Now, one reason to think that it is not is that while a liberal state certainly has a duty to respect people's freedom to pursue whatever conception of the good they want within the limits of justice, it is not clear that a state should have a positive duty to facilitate through subsidies such pursuit. And Ted is aware of it, and he provides 3 arguments in favor of subsidies. So the first is that such subsidies assist individuals with minority preferences in overcoming collective action problems in the production of discretionary goods. But if such goods are discretionary, one might wonder, and if we set aside, as Ted does, question of historical injustice towards particular minorities, arguably a liberal state committed to neutrality should not fund discretionary goods according to majority preferences to begin with. So it's then unclear why there is a need to help minorities find their own preferred version of those goods to rebalance the balance. Second, Ted says that subsidies would help to expand the range of valuable options available to citizens generally. But again, here one may wonder, why are not adequate options sufficient? And by adequate option here, I mean the options that people would produce by freely associating, pulling together resources without, however, the help of subsidies. And finally, Ted argues that subsidies will facilitate a diverse and vibrant civil society. But again, if we assume background conditions of relative equalities, subsidies may not be necessary for the purpose of securing a vibrant civil society and may actually undesirably render the private more dependent on the public than it needs to be. So again, but there is, and here I mean, this is my final sort of question. There is, I think, a methodological issue that Ted's arguments for subsidies raises, right? This argument assumes just background conditions. And it also assumes that what people have in their pockets is rightfully their own. But clearly existing background conditions are not just, and I think it's safe to say that most theories of distributive justice book converge on the verdict that a lot of what rich people have in their pocket is not, in fact, rightfully their own. Now, this changes a lot in the argument, because if what people have in their pocket is not their own, I don't think a state can be permitted to subsidize their discretionary spending of their resources. But even more importantly, this changes the very way we should think about philanthropy, because of course, conceptually, the philanthropic action is based on the idea that what we give is rightfully their own. So a lot of donation may not even conceptually speaking count as philanthropy. And again, I think Ted is perfectly aware of this problem and treats it in the chapter on effective altruism, but almost as if the problem was confined to the relationship between affluent countries and poorer countries, so as a matter of global justice. But I see no reason why this problem should not affect also the way we think about domestic justice. So to conclude, when it comes to developing an action guiding normative theory of philanthropy, does it really make sense to abstract away from background inequality? And what is there to be gained from this abstraction? And this may sound rhetorical questions, but they are truly not. And I'm, again, generally interested in knowing, what Ted has to say in response. So thank you again for this wonderful book.
Thank you so much, Kiara. That was really excellent. And now I'm going to ask Maribel to give us her commentary. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiara, and thank you, John, and thank you. Congratulations, Ted, too. It's been years that we've seen this book in the making, and I can imagine and remember our conversations in Stockholm, back at Stanford, and then via Zoom after the pandemic. So just to pause and say congratulations. And I did get my copy, so we can celebrate it here. It exists, it's real. Okay, so I wanted to start off by reading a section of your book, if that's okay, where you summarize some of your main arguments. We can get rooted there as well. Call that the historian in me. So on page 197, you mention, I have tried to show that even when philanthropy comes with noble intentions, just goals, and rigorous methods, as Kiara was mentioning, by the way, it can objectionably privatize matters that all of us have equal interest in deciding, augment the power of the richer at the expense of the poor, empower the dead at the expense of the living, and perpetuate structural inequalities between donors and recipients. Democracy's contribution to the ethics of philanthropy isn't merely critical, however. To overthrow the tyranny of generosity is not to vanquish it, but to reorient it. Reflection on the value of democracy shows how philanthropy can be consistent with and facilitative of the democratic ideal. When sensitively regulated and conducted, philanthropy provides a valuable vehicle for individual liberty that complements and strengthens democratic institutions. By financing discretionary public goods, philanthropy can compensate for the inherent limitations of majority rule. By financing expressive associations, it can help foster a vibrant civil society that cultivates democratic virtues, nourishes public deliberation, and holds the state accountable. In cases where the state is crippled, corrupted, or nascent, philanthropy can be a vital force for securing the roots of democratic governance. For these reasons, a democratic order that thrives without philanthropy support is exceedingly difficult to conceive. So with that background, I have a central question for you. I understand that a lot of the literature coming out in our networks of scholars focuses on philanthropy and democracy. And you mentioned, but you also in the book question on page 5, why exactly is democracy valuable? And I think that's a great question to pose. Now, the question for me is, why is it valuable when discussing the relative value of philanthropy? So not just what is expected of democracy, but also why should that be the second term in our analysis of why philanthropy is or isn't valuable? in society? And I ask that too, not only because, as you mentioned at the end of the book, some would say that democratic life is in crisis around the world, but because philanthropy is global and arguably beyond the scope of democratic societies. In the book, you do suggest that another metric to analyze the value of philanthropy in society would be power. So analyzing its relative power vis-a-vis different residents of society. And we see that in your analysis of intergenerational charitable transfers, and also in your analysis of effective altruist approach to giving. So that central question for me is, should we as scholars be thinking about analyzing the value added of philanthropy in the context of power instead of democracy? Why still continue with this measurement against democracy? And how is that valuable if we're thinking about it globally? My second main question is rooted in chapter 2, where you argue that, quote, the state is required to provide a society with those collective goods that are essential to realizing principles of justice. And you go on to explain some of these essential goods. And on page 47, you mentioned in practice, the view implies that a state is required to furnish not only the standard list of public goods like national defense, a legal system, and public health measures, but also goods directly related to the provision of a decent social minimum, such as basic education, health insurance, legal insurance, and unemployment insurance. A society that relies on private initiatives to produce and distribute these essential goods fails to treat its subjects as citizens and fails to treat its citizens as equals. You also mentioned that festivals, museums, literary magazines, space exploration, and research into rare medical conditions are all items fit for private provision. So one, I was hoping that you could talk a little bit more, and it leans on to what Kiara was mentioning, your distinction between discretionary and essential goods. How do you come to define these? And at some level, you lean on the majority's will to define what the essential goods are. But as we've seen in the US context even, if you're a minority and trying to access some of these essential goods, sometimes a majority-run government will try to limit your access to them, including schooling. And we know the history of segregated schooling, the history of white flight from schools. So how do you think through essential public goods that the majority might not want to provide to minorities and have the state power to limit their access to them? And another question within the essential versus discretionary goods, I'm going to ask, where's knowledge production? I know you mentioned here of, where was it? Research into rare medical conditions, but I'm thinking about knowledge production in the social sciences and humanities, for example. We know the public consequences of how we analyze each other and how that could lead to discriminatory practices for each other in the public realm. So who should be funding knowledge production in the social sciences and humanities? Under this analysis, should we be considering it an essential good to be financed by the state or a discretionary one? And even if we consider it to be an essential good financed by the state, if the majority has power over the state, we don't exactly leave all the problems behind. So I would welcome your analysis on that, basically, the role of knowledge in your binary between essential and discretionary. And lastly, I just wanted to congratulate you on many years' work. Congratulations.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Maribel. So Ted, you have a rich array of comments there, and it would be unfair to expect you to sort of go into detail in all the important points that were raised, but here's your chance maybe to respond to some of them, and then we'll carry on the conversation from there.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Kiara and Maribel for these really rich and stimulating comments. I find some of them a bit flummoxing, and they're definitely things I'm going to want to think more about for the sequel to this book. But let's start maybe with Kiara's first question about what would be wrong if we had a democratic decision to outsource the funding of essential public goods to private parties. especially if there was some kind of procedure in place to allow for periodic reauthorization of this decision. And you can stipulate even further, I guess, we would be in a sort of ideal society where, people enjoyed equal opportunity for political influence. There were no sort of defects in background conditions. I see the pull of that objection, to be honest. I can imagine a scenario like that one, where there could be an authentic, democratically authorized decision to outsource funding to private parties, precisely under those conditions. What I don't think is that that's an accurate characterization of any existing society. It's tempting to say that in societies that have more or less outsourced a great deal of funding and decision-making about essential public goods to private parties, that this reflects some kind of revealed popular preference. If societies really wanted to, regain control and democratic authorization and accountability of these things, they certainly could do so. I think that's difficult to believe, given the extent of existing political inequalities and the crippled nature of many political systems today. But I certainly can imagine this sort of rarefied philosophical experiment in which such a thing might be possible. I think I will turn now to some of Maribel's questions. So first of all, why should we use democracy as the litmus test for philanthropy, especially given that democratic systems are under threat or have proven themselves to be flawed in many ways, or because of the fact that relationships between donors and recipients are not confined to democratic societies. Philanthropy is a practice that occurs outside of democratic societies in authoritarian conditions as well. Why not analyze things purely in terms of power? And I think the thing to say there is that I don't view democracy simply as a set of processes or as a regime, but providing us as a set of principles precisely to analyze the distribution and exercise of power. Democracy is a way of relating to one another as free and equal individuals, as respecting one another as social equals. And that, I think, is something that travels across borders and across regimes and remains highly relevant no matter what the context is. So the question of knowledge production, whether that might be an essential public good, this sort of brings us back to the question of, what do I think about philanthropy in the context of higher education, which is a question that I deliberately run away from in this book. I think the finance of higher education raises a bunch of unusual and complex issues that I think would take at least another book to deal with. So I think that's a bit of a special case. One thing I do say, though, is that, even in the case of discretionary public goods, I think there's often a strong case for collective control and funding of certain aspects, precisely for the reasons that Maribel mentions, that we need to ensure public access and non-discrimination, the funding of big projects. Some of these can't be satisfied. Some of these desiderata can't be satisfied if discretionary public goods are left entirely to private donors. So there's often a significant role for the state, even in the production of discretionary public goods that are supplemented by private funding. I think I'll leave it there in the interest of stimulating further discussion, though I'm really grateful for these comments. They've given me a lot more to think about, and a reminder that a project like this is really never finished. It's only just begun.
Absolutely. So just a reminder to those watching us, we're very keen to receive any questions from the audience. So, please use the chat function in order to give us those questions. But I just want to give the commentators a chance to come back on something. So, for example, I thought Kiara's point about why couldn't there be democratic authorization, you kind of responded by saying that's a very nice thought experiment, but it isn't in any kind of attunement with reality. But Kiara also made the point that you yourself adopt an idealized background, conditions of equality, right? So Kiara, were you satisfied with that response from Ted, that that your proposal was a highly idealized one, but doesn't correspond to reality?
So if you see on this, I was thinking, and actually this is something that, so I was thinking that there might be perhaps a slightly different answer that actually would support Ted's, what I think Ted's thrust of the argument. And here I'm thinking about the work also of Eric Birbaum, who at some point said, there are certain duties like repaying debts that simply constitutively cannot be outsourced, right? Because if I can authorize someone else to pay a debt on my behalf, but with my own money. If I had to ask someone else to pay debts with their own money, it simply I would fail to discharge these duties. So I wonder whether a response that would keep an idealized framework, so in the sense compatible with ideal theory, but perhaps rejecting in a certain way more straightforwardly the challenge that my question posed, would be to say, the duty to provide essential goods, it's a reciprocal duty of justice of some kind, and it's constitutive part of that duty that we can outsource it simply because we cannot, in the sense that the duty would vanish. And so I wonder maybe, if that could be perhaps also a way of reconcile the ideal framework with the democratic challenge, let's say.
Can I respond to that, John?
Yeah, that was a more uncompromising response than the one that you suggested, so go ahead.
I think I want to dispute the extent to which my account is idealized, precisely because when I actually get to the discussion of how subsidies might be administered, there's a lot of work done there to reduce background inequalities and reduce the influence of wealth. And so I think you can imagine this argument moving in two steps. One step is to ask, is philanthropy under some kind of condition something worth subsidizing? And in a second step, ask, how might we do that in a way that's sensitive to unjust background conditions? There's also, discussion at several points throughout the book, hammering in the point that, societies still need to do much more to moderate background inequalities in wealth, regardless of what they're doing with policies towards philanthropy. This is something that's extremely important, but that point has been made many times before. What we often fail to appreciate is that even if we were to rein in control of sort of runaway inequalities in wealth, unless we're willing to go all the way and enforce a very strict form of economic inequality, I think there would still be pertinent inequalities in the world of philanthropy that are worth thinking more about.
Maribel, do you want to take up anything that Ted has said in response to your comments?
Yeah, no, I think these are conversations to have for eternity. These are life conversations, lifelong ones. As far as the response about democracy, I like the response. It made me feel good, okay, to hear that it's expandable and it's an image of viewing each other as social equals.
I think scalable is the term people prefer now, right?
But then after I get off my euphoria, I start thinking about, there's an absence of the state, and the model of analysis that you offer here in a democracy and that we talk about in other books. And it's really about the alternative form where you have citizens at some way, not even residents, but people who can deliberate officially in the democratic process. There's a process, right, of dialogue that has consequences, and there's a public realm where you have representatives. And so there's layers in your book that explain democracy as a social structure with processes that necessarily fall apart the moment you're outside of that structure. So I would just ask as a follow-up how you imagine that analysis of democracy really playing out without those structures that kind of start tumbling down outside of that society at the global level playing out. Like, Yeah.
Sure. So let's imagine sort of low-income countries and developing contexts, and some of these considerations come up in the chapter on effective altruism, where people are often talking about transnational donations between the global north and global south, particularly in sort of non-democratic contexts. And one thing I say about those cases is that I think it's important to keep democratic ideals sort of somewhere in mind, in the picture, and that when someone is making donations for humanitarian or developmental purposes, it's very important to do that in a way that is consistent with the facilitation of democratic institutions, that doesn't push away the possibility of collective self-governance, that's not focused solely on economic growth or some other aspect of well-being, but has really a sort of transitional and developmental mode that's respectful of differences in power and ultimately, seeks to assist a society become self-governing.
Ted, can I ask you something a bit about the sort of conceptual structure of the book? So apologies if this is an excessively arid philosophical question, but you started off by saying that you work with a very broad conception of philanthropy. And in particular, you don't make much of any distinction between philanthropy and charity. So I guess you see charity as something that could be subsumed within philanthropy. So therefore, you've got a discussion that includes within its scope someone giving a huge amount of money to create a museum of modern art and someone giving a huge amount of money to address child hunger. I just wonder that those seem quite different things, right? One is attending to like life and death issues of children in society, the other to more sort of refined aesthetic tastes that may not be shared by everyone. So can you just sort of clarify, do you think that within the kinds of objectives that exist within your expansive concept of philanthropy, different principles might apply so that we might be more comfortable or less democratically worried about some of these forms than others? I'm not sure which one would be less democratically worrisome. Or do you think, no, the mere fact that they're within this category of philanthropy generates the problem, in a sense, uniformly? The second question, so that's a question about philanthropy in relation to charity. The second question is that you say our democratic sovereignty has to be exercised over matters of basic justice. But what is basic justice? When do I know that something is a matter of basic justice or something is a valuable thing, but it's not really a matter of basic justice? I'm assuming there are two steps there. One is a step about it's a matter of justice. And then you have a further step saying, not just any old justice, basic justice. So what is that domain of sovereignty that you call basic justice?
Thanks, John. Not entirely arid, really important and sort of penetrating questions. So on the distinction between charity and philanthropy, one reason why I try to avoid sort of getting into that kind of discussion is particularly that the line between these two things is debated ad nauseum. So some people think that it's charity when it's practiced by a non-wealthy person, but it's philanthropy when it's practiced by a wealthy person. Or it's charity if it were responding to basic needs, but it's philanthropy if we're responding to something else. Or it's charity if it's some sort of supererogatory duty, and if it's philanthropy, it's something else entirely. Anyways, I'm interested in, as you say, in this sort of broader practice, which involves the donation of private property for public purposes. And I think, as I say in the book, there are a range of important, principled considerations and challenges that arise when we just make that initial cut. Of course, we can also go down the line and interrogate, distinctions between different objects of giving, different ways of giving, and agree that, there are certain aspects may be more or less democratic, more or less consistent with justice. I think those are rich areas to explore further, and I don't think I would disagree with that point. I think the sort of emphasis on the book is to notice the sort of more general category and the sort of general problems and principles that arrive just in the practice of private giving for public purposes. Second question, how do we know if something is a matter of basic justice? This I think is a real challenge for the argument, because public goods themselves are not natural kinds, neither are matters of basic justice. It depends a great deal on the context, background conditions, what pre-existing institutions are in place. And I make a stab at a few different definitions of basic justice in the book. I try to draw on Elizabeth Anderson's conception of democratic equality, where basic justice refers to, basically whatever is necessary to prevent oppression and domination and to allow us to stand in relationships of equal citizenship. But that's sort of just a buck passing account, right? It doesn't tell us concretely, what kinds of goods are actually necessary for the satisfaction of basic justice. We can pull on, lists that are commonly referred to. Something is a matter of basic justice if it involves sort of police protection, if it involves social assistance, if it involves basic education. But these are sort of very fuzzy categories because, how then are we going to define the boundaries of basic education or social assistance? So I think that is definitely an area of the argument that needs more thinking.
Sorry about that. Just as an example, imagine someone is a fanatic for real tennis and wants to see the revival of real tennis in England and devotes millions of pounds to encouraging people to participate in real tennis and learn about it, etc. How do we begin to ask if this is a basic justice matter? What is your sort of initial kind of way of approaching that question?
I think I would just go back to something I said a moment ago. Is tennis essential for allowing us to stand in relationships of social equality with one another? Is this necessary for a scheme of cooperation among equals? That doesn't seem to be the case to me with regard to tennis. I think it would be even difficult for the person in your scenario to agree to that they might be very fond of tennis and think it serves a lot of important purposes.
Remember, it's real tennis. It's not just tennis.
Right, real tennis. Yeah, tennis as a way of life. I just.
But then I could imagine someone saying, "Well, is philosophical research necessary to our equal standing?"
Yeah, this goes back to Maribel's question and the sort of knowledge production issue. How much of knowledge production is necessary, and I think the answer has to be a certain amount is necessary to satisfy basic justice. But there's also a limit. If everybody is a philosopher, that seems like we've wasted a lot of money, to be honest.
Well, I kind of think everyone is a philosopher, but let me ask you some questions from the audience now. So, first one is from Rob Haywood, and he says, to what extent might we consider that democracy can get it wrong in determining the appropriate priorities? Employee votes on corporate giving often display patterns and biases that effective altruists might find troubling.
I appreciate the question, Rob. I'll be curious to know what other panelists think of this question. But sort of one thing I do say in the book is that my view of democracy is not sort of unlimited popular rule. It's not unlimited majority rule. It's a sort of constitutionalized understanding of democracy or a liberal understanding of democracy that embeds within it recognition of basic human rights, and even things like judicial review, which I think can be consistent with democratic sovereignty properly understood. So certainly, I think majorities can get things wrong. Historically, they have and currently do all the time. I want to sort of resist sort of eliding sort of popularity and popular rule with sort of true democratic procedures. And I think it's important in those cases to have certain corrections in place to prevent those kinds of distortions, which I do throughout the book. So for instance, when I talk about using philanthropy to supplement the challenges of majority rule. I see philanthropy there as assisting and being part of a democratic system, even though it's not a sort of popular or majoritarian practice.
Do either Maribel or Kiara want to address this question as well? Or I can go on to the next one. Kiara, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with Ted. I would say that I think the answer fundamentally depends on what you think is the grounding value of democratic systems. And depending on what your answer is to it, there might be a duty to preserve a democratic system. So it's not something that is just good, but it's something that is morally necessitated, either because, I don't know, it's necessary to secure a relationship of non-domination or racial equality, or if that's the case, then it seems that at least there has to be some substantive limit to what democracy can democratically decide, including a limit to respect basic conditions for the maintenance of democratic self-rules. And so this goes back to the question of basic justice and some level of knowledge formation, right, and other things. And democracy cannot outsource or cannot give up those kind of conditions democratically. So I would say something along those lines.
Ted, in response to this question, oh, sorry, go ahead, Maribel.
No, I actually think this is a good point that, Ted, you can develop in your next book, because I do think there's a lot of space here. Going to John's point and Kiara's, on page 47, you do provide examples of essential goods, a list of them, but there's room there to explain why you think those are essential goods and why other ones like festivals, museums, etc., are non-essential or discretionary. And as much as I really appreciate the definition of democracy you offer, I think it's really thoughtful and that you subscribe to. At the same time, I don't know if it's slip of the tongue or slip of the typewriter, not typewriter, or computers, but in the book, there's mention of majority and collective and associating those preferences with essential goods. And that does create that tension about whether you think that certain essential goods are essential, even if the majority might not want to provide it for the whole collective. I'm thinking the history in the US of, really undermining and limiting the welfare state out of white supremacy, right? So I think there's a lot of great room for further analysis in your distinction between essential and discretionary and its relationship to majority will in a democracy.
Maybe just one thing to add here is that the main thrust of the book is not to claim a sort of democratic absolutism. It's really to rescue democratic considerations which have been missing from a lot of these conversations about philanthropy, and to show, precisely why democracy is something to care about and what principles it consists in, so that we can make these kinds of trade-offs when we need to with a clear mind.
Just going back to Rob's question a little bit. So the idea of democracy getting it wrong, you've said that, well, you don't just mean majoritarianism, there's going to be protection of human rights, there might be judicial review. It raises also another question, which is one of the ways we can avoid democracies getting it wrong is by integrating some kind of expert judgment within the process of democratic deliberation. So do you think that there is, I know you threw out the suggestion, I don't know if it's in the book, about universities playing a role, but is there some potential for expert guidance that would be available to democratic citizens in determining these sorts of priorities?
Yeah, I do have a sort of throwaway remark in the book about what I think might be a more valuable alternative to philanthropic foundations in the sort of experimentation of social policy, which is to have universities playing a larger role in doing kinds of social policy research that is often tasked with foundations. So I do think that is one potential idea to explore further, ways of incorporating expertise into these processes. But there are many sort of other interesting institutional design options to consider if we want to make democracies wiser. Deliberative polls, for instance, are an important feature, I think. Mechanisms just to enrich the process of participation and deliberation in the first place. If you believe that part of what makes deliberation valuable is that it helps to uncover true ideas, then deliberation is something that you should want to encourage more of rather than less of in a democratic system, without necessarily, trying to locate and recruit people who have specialized knowledge sort of directly.
Let me ask you this very interesting bottom line question from Amy Schiller. She says, do you anticipate giving totals will remain steady, increase, or decrease if we limit philanthropy to discretionary goods? Are incentives to give to essential goods transferable to discretionary ones? So what's the bottom line effect of your book, Dr. Lechterman?
The effect on GDP or something. It's a very good question. I'm not a behavioral economist. I'm not going to sort of predict the sort of behavioral incentive effects of different policies. I think maybe part of what's motivating the question, or one way to motivate that kind of question, is the thought that giving might shrink if people can only give to what I've termed discretionary public goods, because there's a lot of motivation in solving problems that seem more significant. One wants to be sort of helpful in a more serious way than only to be able to contribute to things which are, as I've called them, discretionary. And that is possible. I'm not sure that would be such a terrible thing. If essential public goods were already taken care of by democratic societies, what would be so bad about having a smaller philanthropic sector devoted to a range of more discretionary pursuits? I'm not sure that would be so bad.
Any comments from Kiara or Maribel on this?
This question, although different in spirit, but brings me back to the issue of idealization, because I think I am fully sympathetic to Ted's use of idealization for one function of idealization that I take to be a diagnostic function. So it's almost like it works like an economics model. We eliminate the problem of background inequality, we eliminate the problem of bad intention, we eliminate the problem, and we neutralize these variables to see what would still be problematic with philanthropy. And on that, I'm fully on board, and I think it brings very, importantly, these issues of democratic sovereignty up front. But what I disagree with is then how this use of idealization instead as a regulative idea, like what should be the role of philanthropy in a society with no background inequality or with very reduced background inequality? And the reason, not that there is something wrong with asking the question, but I think it can be obfuscating in the sense, first, we're very far from that society, but philanthropy is not like justice or freedom. It's actually a concrete, sociologically lived practice. So then the question is, how can I even imagine this practice right in a world where there wouldn't be inequality? Would people give? Would people, care about discretionary goods? I don't know. We would be different people to some extent. But also, my fear here is that it could be regarded as this idealization as playing an ideological role, right? Because we are talking about discretionary goods, but again, if the money are not your own, you shouldn't even think about giving it to discretionary good. And so my question is, doesn't this second use of idealization then sort of confuse, right, the normative prescriptions, we may say?
Ed?
Yeah, it probably does to a certain extent. I think, the idealization remains helpful as a sort of North Star, as a way of ensuring that sort of whatever policies that we propose in the here and now are going to be consistent with progress towards that ideal. The point is not to assume that the ideal already exists, but to make sure that any policies or actions that we suggest are coherent or consistent with that kind of ideal. But I agree that I think, in certain parts of the book, I'm perhaps too much guided by that North Star, and it can be a bit distracting from dealing with sort of more local and near-term problems.
Maribel, is there anything you want to add to this discussion?
Yeah, no, I was thinking through this, thinking about, Andrew Carnegie and violence in strike breaking. And I'm thinking of Bezos now and Amazon and, working conditions. And so I'm thinking about your book, Ted, if it incorporated those tensions. And I'm thinking too now, like Hannah Arendt, in the social realm of there's a complete fighting and, that's a space of contestation. So I'm building upon Kiara's point, and I hope I'm doing justice to it, Kiara, but if we injected those levels of violence, of wealth extraction, inequality, those narratives before, 2 seconds before that a philanthropist is deciding, or you're deciding whether that philanthropist should be able to provide essential goods or only discretionary goods in the public realm. If we injected all that violence and expropriation right before that, 1 second before it, how would it change your analysis in the book, or not at all?
I'm not sure it really would change the analysis significantly, precisely because, I think, first of all, the point of doing political philosophy is not necessarily to solve current public problems or to offer, direct policy advice, but rather to think about things a bit more abstractly and introduce ideas into public conversation to help clarify different arguments and values. I think political theorists and philosophers are particularly bad at sorting out the sort of messiness of day-to-day politics and struggle. Many people are much better at doing that. So the thought is that, thinking about why philanthropy might be valuable, why democracy might be valuable, these remain, important questions to ask and answer that hopefully can play some use, when applied to practical real-world struggles, but shouldn't be a replacement for sort of on-the-ground grappling.
Let me just conclude by just saying a few words. And I think the first thing I want to say is when I was first in Oxford teaching from 98 to 2010, democracy was not like a hugely salient topic in the theory of politics paper. It's quite unusual. The focus was on justice, and for various reasons, which we could go into, partly within the academy, partly external, democracy has now, amongst the younger generation of political philosophers, become a really salient topic. And Ted's book, which I have a copy of, thanks to Ted, fantastic cover, by the way, is a wonderful example of how things that we take for granted suddenly seem to us in a different perspective and a new light once we think about them in terms of their implications for democracy and what the value of democracy really is. And I think this is what Ted has achieved in this book. It's an incredibly well-written, but also rigorous and super careful. It's not sort of making bold claims that it can't substantiate. It's a very careful, rigorous book, really trying to chase out the idea, what would philanthropy look like in a genuinely democratic society? So I hugely recommend it. I think, if you're really interested in democracy, given the role that philanthropy is increasingly playing, especially in light of increasing inequalities, this is a really important book. So thank you very much, Ted, for letting us launch the book. And thank you so much to our two commentators, Maribel and Kiara, for their wonderful comments today. Thank you, and thank you to all of you for watching this. Thanks a lot.